They thought they could intimidate me while I was away. The HOA president, a woman named Cynthia, called the police claiming I was trespassing on my own property. What she didn't know was that while she was plotting against me, she had been secretly living inside my mansion for weeks. And when I returned home that evening, the truth came crashing down on her in a way she'd never forget. My name is Marcus, and I had just spent the week on a business trip. I work in real estate management, often traveling for inspections and client meetings. My mansion wasn't just a home. It was the culmination of years of hard work, a place my family had invested everything into. The sprawling estate, with its manicured lawns, multiple guest wings, and high-tech security, was a sanctuary I took pride in protecting. I had left early Monday morning, giving Cynthia, the HOA president, a polite warning that I would be gone for several days. She had been increasingly difficult over the past months, nitpicking every detail about my property, from the color of my driveway lights to the placement of flower beds. Her demands were constant, but I'd always complied as long as it didn't compromise my privacy. When I returned home that Friday evening, I noticed something immediately off. My mailbox had been ripped open, letters scattered across the driveway. A few neighbors were standing nearby, whispering and pointing toward my mansion. I slowed the car and saw 2 patrol cars parked on the circular driveway, lights flashing. My stomach dropped. I stepped out, hands raised slightly, trying to keep my voice calm. "Officers, what's going on?" One of the officers, a young man looking slightly embarrassed, stepped forward. "Sir, we received a call from the HOA president. She said someone was trespassing on this property. We came to investigate." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. A call from the HOA? But this is my home. I've lived here for years. No one else has permission to be here. The second officer glanced toward the open front doors. "We were told the person inside the mansion is claiming to own it. Apparently, there's someone inside right now?" I froze. My pulse quickened. "Inside?" "Yes, sir," the first officer said. "The HOA president. She claims she's authorized to be here. Says she's inspecting the property for compliance." I blinked, disbelief mixing with rising anger. "Cynthia? She's inside my home?" Before the officers could respond, I started toward the mansion. Every step was a mix of fury and disbelief. She had crossed the line. She had broken into my sanctuary, my personal space, and now she was trying to make it seem like I was the intruder. I entered through the side door cautiously. The mansion smelled faintly of perfume and candles, signs someone had been living there. My study, usually organized down to the last paper, was in disarray. Drawers were partially open. My computer had been moved. And there she was, Cynthia, standing in the middle of the living room with her clipboard, adjusting a vase as if she belonged there. She looked up at me, surprised but not scared. "Marcus," she said, her tone condescending, "I didn't expect you back so soon." I clenched my fists. "Didn't expect me back? You mean you didn't expect to be caught living in my house without permission?" She waved her hand dismissively. "I'm just making sure everything complies with HOA regulations. You know, for your own good." I laughed, cold and incredulous. "For my own good? You've been living in my mansion for days, maybe weeks, without permission. That's not regulation. That's theft." The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure how to handle this. I stepped closer to Cynthia, voice rising with controlled anger. "Let me make this clear. You are trespassing. You are unlawfully occupying my property. And you called the cops on me to cover your own crimes." Cynthia's expression faltered for a split second, just enough for me to notice. Then she straightened, trying to regain composure. I thought I was doing the right thing. The HOA has standards to enforce, and—" "No," I interrupted sharply. "You thought you could live here, use my resources, and intimidate me while I was away. That's not doing the right thing. That's criminal behavior." The officers stepped forward, gently moving Cynthia toward the door. She tried to protest, but her voice was tinged with panic. "I'm the HOA president. I have authority. You don't understand the rules." I shook my head. "No, the rules don't give you permission to enter someone's home illegally. And you certainly don't get to call the cops to make it seem like I'm the trespasser in my own house." One officer finally said, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us. We'll sort out the legality of your actions." Cynthia's face turned red, humiliation mixed with fear. She struggled briefly, then allowed herself to be escorted out. I stood in the middle of my living room, finally breathing freely again. Every item she had touched, every corner she had invaded, was a reminder of how audacious some people could be when they thought no one was watching. Once Cynthia was gone, I walked through the mansion, taking stock of the disarray. Nothing was destroyed, thankfully, but the personal violation was enough to make me lock down every room and reset the security system. My mansion, my sanctuary, had been compromised, but I wasn't going to let it happen again. Neighbors started trickling in after hearing the news. Some came to apologize, saying they had suspected she was up to something, but didn't want to get involved. Others shook their heads in disbelief, asking how anyone could act so recklessly. I smiled faintly, grateful for their support. "She's gone," I said. "The house is mine. The HOA has no authority to enter, no matter what she claims." The week ahead was about documentation, evidence, and making sure this could never happen again. I collected everything: security footage, recordings, witness statements. Cynthia's actions were deliberate, not impulsive, and I knew the best way to handle her was legally, methodically, and without letting anger dictate my actions. Even after Cynthia was escorted out, I knew she wouldn't stop scheming. People like her thrive on control, on fear, on the illusion of power. She had underestimated me once, but I wasn't going to let her try a second time. I spent the next morning reviewing all the security footage, making sure every frame was logged and backed up. Every room she had entered, every movement, every attempt to manipulate the situation was recorded. I called my attorney to review the evidence. "Marcus," she said, "you have a strong case. Trespassing, false reporting, intimidation. We can escalate this if necessary. You just need to remain calm and precise." "I understand," I replied, "but I want to make sure it's not just about me. The neighbors have been intimidated by her for months. I want this to set a precedent so no one else is targeted." By late morning, I began visiting neighbors one by one. Some had stayed silent before, afraid of HOA retaliation. But now, seeing Cynthia's audacity exposed, they were ready to talk. "Marcus," said Mrs. Allen from 2 doors down, "we knew she was overreaching, but we didn't expect her to actually live inside your mansion." "Exactly," I said, "and that's why I want to make sure this doesn't happen again. The HOA isn't above the law, and no one here should feel powerless in their own home." I documented each conversation, taking note of the complaints and fears the neighbors had endured. Cynthia had relied on intimidation, but once her behavior was exposed, the community's support swung entirely in my favor. That afternoon, I decided it was time for a more direct confrontation with the HOA board. Cynthia had been suspended temporarily, but the rest of the board needed to understand the gravity of the situation. I sent a formal request for a meeting, making it clear that I would present evidence of her trespassing, harassment, and false reports. The meeting was tense. The board members shuffled nervously, avoiding eye contact, whispering among themselves. Cynthia wasn't present, but her influence lingered like a shadow. "Thank you for coming," I began. "I've come today to address the actions of your president, Cynthia Matthews. She has repeatedly violated the law by entering my property without permission, filing false police reports, and attempting to intimidate me and the community." One board member muttered, We didn't know she would go this far." "I understand," I said calmly, "but ignorance doesn't excuse illegal behavior. Her actions have consequences, and as a board, you are responsible for oversight. Allowing this behavior to continue unchecked puts everyone at risk, not just me. I presented the security footage, recordings of her calls, and statements from neighbors. The evidence was undeniable. Each clip, each recording, highlighted not just her audacity, but her deliberate attempts to manipulate the system. This, I said, gesturing toward the footage, shows someone abusing authority under the guise of enforcement. This is not compliance. It's coercion, trespassing, and harassment. The board members were silent, clearly realizing the severity of the situation. Cynthia's aura of authority had dissolved in an instant, replaced by the uncomfortable reality of her criminal actions. After the meeting, I knew the HOA would be cautious moving forward, but Cynthia herself remained a threat if she tried another stunt. I prepared for any potential escalation by setting up additional cameras and alert systems around the mansion. I also informed the local police about the evidence I had, making it clear that any further attempts by Cynthia to manipulate or trespass would be met with immediate enforcement. A few days later, Cynthia attempted to file another complaint, claiming I had harassed her during her removal. I calmly forwarded all the evidence, video, audio, and witness statements to the authorities. Within 24 hours, her claim was dismissed, and she was officially warned about legal repercussions if she continued filing false reports. Meanwhile, word of the incident spread throughout the neighborhood. Many neighbors came by, expressing relief and gratitude. "I can't believe she actually lived there," said one, shaking their head. "We've been afraid of her for years." "I'm glad this is over," I said, "but it's important everyone understands. Authority doesn't give anyone the right to break the law. Cynthia overstepped, and now she's facing the consequences." The neighborhood slowly began to heal. People who had stayed silent before now spoke openly about past incidents, realizing that intimidation had no place when evidence and the law were on your side. I made sure to support them, explaining how they could document incidents and protect themselves from future harassment. At home, I spent evenings reviewing security systems, checking locks, and ensuring the mansion was fully secure. The intrusion had been personal and invasive, but nothing was destroyed. My home was safe, my sanctuary intact, and Cynthia's reign of intimidation effectively over. One afternoon, I noticed a few new families moving into the area. They were curious about the mansion, asking neighbors about the HOA and any issues they might face. I explained briefly, emphasizing that the law protects homeowners and that the community had a voice if the HOA tried to overreach. Cynthia, in the meantime, became increasingly desperate. She tried to rally support among some HOA members, but her credibility had evaporated. Even those who had once deferred to her authority realized how reckless and unlawful her actions had been. By the end of the week, I had drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. It summarized all incidents, included evidence, and outlined the legal consequences of any further harassment or trespassing. Copies were sent to local authorities, ensuring that any attempt by Cynthia to act again would be documented and legally actionable. I also took steps to reclaim the mansion fully for my family and myself. Additional locks were installed, security protocols updated, and staff briefed on vigilance. I wanted to prevent any future breaches and to make it clear that the mansion was not a space for intimidation or manipulation. Through all this, I learned something crucial. People like Cynthia thrive on fear and the illusion of power, but patience, evidence, and measured action can dismantle even the boldest attempts at control. The law is a powerful tool when wielded correctly, and standing firm in the face of intimidation is not only necessary, but effective. By the end of the second week, Cynthia had been formally investigated for multiple incidents: trespassing, harassment, and filing false police reports. Her suspension remained in effect, and the HOA board implemented new policies to prevent similar abuse in the future. Neighbors began to relax, and the atmosphere in the community shifted. What had once been a climate of fear and overreach was now one of cautious optimism. People realized that standing up to abuse wasn't futile. It could create real change. That evening, I walked through the mansion, inspecting each room, making sure everything was in order. The violation I had endured left a mark, but it also reminded me of the importance of vigilance, preparation, and acting decisively when necessary. The mansion was safe again, but more importantly, justice had been served. Sitting on the balcony, I watched the sunset over the gardens, reflecting on the events of the past 2 weeks. Cynthia's arrogance and abuse of authority had met consequences, and the community had regained a sense of empowerment. Standing firm, with evidence and patience, had turned what could have been a nightmare into a victory for myself and everyone around me. By the 3rd week, Cynthia had realized that her usual tactics of intimidation were no longer working. She tried contacting some HOA members, hoping they'd back her up, but her credibility had evaporated. Even those who had once deferred to her authority now recognized how reckless and unlawful her actions had been. I knew it was only a matter of time before her desperation led her to make another mistake. I stayed vigilant, monitoring the mansion and keeping records of any suspicious activity. The cameras and security systems were my silent allies, and the detailed documentation I had gathered ensured that any attempt she made would be immediately exposed. One afternoon, I received a call from the local authorities. "Marcus," said the officer on the line, "we've reviewed all the evidence you submitted. Cynthia Matthews is under formal investigation for trespassing, harassment, and filing false reports. If she attempts any further action, there will be legal consequences." I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. The law was finally catching up to her. Later that day, I decided it was time to confront the HOA board one last time. Cynthia had been suspended, but the board as a whole needed to understand that their negligence allowed this situation to occur. I scheduled a formal meeting at a neutral location, inviting all members. As I entered the meeting room, the tension was palpable. Board members shifted nervously in their seats, avoiding my gaze. Cynthia was not present, but the fear of her actions having consequences lingered in the air. "Thank you for meeting with me," I began. "I'm here to address the actions of your president, Cynthia Matthews, and the oversight failures that allowed her to trespass, intimidate, and file false police reports. This is not just about my property. It's about the safety and rights of every homeowner in this community." One member stammered, We didn't know she would go this far. Your lack of oversight created the opportunity for her to violate the law," I said firmly. "Authority does not grant immunity from legal consequences. Your responsibility as a board is to protect homeowners, not enable illegal behavior." I presented the compiled evidence: security footage, recordings, and neighbor statements. Every example highlighted Cynthia's deliberate and unlawful actions. The board members were forced to face the reality of what had happened. "This footage," I said, pointing to the screen, "shows a person abusing power, breaking the law, and attempting to intimidate not just me, but the entire community. Ignoring this behavior is no longer an option." There was silence in the room. The HOA board finally understood the gravity of the situation. Cynthia's influence had vanished, replaced by the undeniable proof of her wrongdoing. After the meeting, I continued reinforcing security measures at the mansion. Every door was double-checked, cameras were repositioned, and alarm systems tested. I wanted to ensure no further attempts at intrusion. My home was mine again, and I wasn't about to risk another violation. Word of Cynthia's actions spread through the neighborhood quickly. Many neighbors expressed relief and gratitude. "We've lived under her intimidation for years," one said. "Seeing this happen to her gives us hope." I explained the importance of documentation and vigilance, showing neighbors how they could protect themselves from similar harassment. It was clear that Cynthia's actions had been part of a larger pattern of bullying, but with evidence and legal action, it could be stopped. A few days later, Cynthia tried a final maneuver, filing a claim alleging harassment during her removal. I calmly forwarded all video recordings, call logs, and witness statements. Within 24 hours, the claim was dismissed, and she was officially warned about further false reports. Her suspension became permanent shortly after, and the HOA board implemented new policies to prevent such abuse. They prohibited any board member from entering a property without written consent, and strict oversight measures were introduced to protect homeowners. With the threat removed, I finally allowed myself to relax. I walked through the mansion, inspecting every room, appreciating the peace and security I had reclaimed. The ordeal had been stressful, but it had also strengthened my resolve to protect my property and my neighbors. Over the next week, I hosted a small gathering for neighbors. Some shared stories of past incidents, expressing relief that justice had been served. Others thanked me for standing firm and showing that the law protects homeowners against overreach. It felt good to not just reclaim my home, but also restore a sense of safety and empowerment in the community. The mansion, once violated, was now a symbol of resilience, not of wealth, but of accountability, not of fear, but of the consequences of overstepping authority. Cynthia, who had believed her position gave her unchecked power, had learned the hard way that actions have consequences. I spent evenings reflecting on what had happened. The invasion of my home had been personal and audacious, but it had been handled methodically, without letting anger take over. Evidence, patience, and calm decisiveness had neutralized her attempts at intimidation. By the end of the month, the HOA issued a statement acknowledging the incident and confirming that stricter oversight measures were now in place. While they did not admit fault outright, it was clear the board had learned their lesson. Cynthia's credibility and influence were gone, and the community had a renewed sense of empowerment. I continued monitoring the mansion and neighborhood for a few weeks, ensuring no further incidents. Security systems were maintained, and neighbors remained vigilant. People had learned that standing up against abuse, when backed by evidence and the law, was effective. One sunny afternoon, as I looked over the gardens I had nurtured for years, I realized the real victory wasn't just reclaiming my home. It was the restoration of justice and the knowledge that intimidation and abuse of authority could be challenged and defeated. Cynthia had faced humiliation, legal consequences, and the permanent loss of her perceived power. For me, there was peace, security, and the satisfaction of seeing justice done. And for my neighbors, there was hope and a renewed sense of control over their own lives. As I sat on the balcony, sipping a cup of coffee, I smiled faintly. The mansion, once a target of intrusion, now stood as a symbol of resilience, law, and patience. The events of that month reminded me that some people live to wield power over others, but there are those prepared, patient, and wise enough to ensure that justice prevails. And when those forces collide, one outcome is guaranteed. Truth, law, and accountability always catch up to arrogance.